Hello, this is Rick Harnish. I'm the Executive Director of the High-Speed Rail Alliance. Thank you all for joining. We've got a very exciting program today. But for those who don't know us, uh, we are a nonprofit. We're advocating for great trains, reconnecting communities across the country. And we help people understand what high-speed and regional rail can be in America, why we need to build it, and what steps you can take to help persuade your state representatives and national representatives, educate them on the steps they can take to actually make it happen in this country. Um, we've got a great speaker today. If you like this program, if you like the idea of being able to ride a train between Chicago and Madison in less than 2 hours, or actually run between Atlanta and Nashville, please join us at highspeedrail.us. And Chris, if you can introduce the speaker.
Sure, thanks, Rick. My name is Chris Ott. I'm the Deputy Director for the High-Speed Rail Alliance, and our talk today has been a long time in the making. But a few months back, one of our supporters said, "You just have to read Gareth Dennis's book," and he even sent us, Rick and me each a copy. And that led to the invitation, which Gareth accepted and brings us to today. So thank you, Bob, for this recommendation. Gareth Dennis is an award-winning railway engineer and writer. He hosts the weekly Rail Natter show and is a regular on podcasts, radio, television, and in print, making the case for railways at the heart of a sustainable future. He's the author of the book, How the Railways Will Fix the Future, and is co-founder of the Campaign for Level Boarding. For our audience, if you have a comment, you can put it in the chat. Please also feel free to share where you're joining us from today if you'd like. I know a bunch of people have started doing that already. And if you have a question, it helps to keep those separate, so please use Zoom's Q&A feature for questions. We'll get to as many of those as we can, and I know Gareth is eager to do that. With that, Gareth, please take it away.
Fantastic. Yeah, I shall share screen. Everyone, I'm getting sound here. I presume that sound is coming through nicely at your end. It's a delight to be joining you. Thank you so much. I've already seen in the chat, actually, people talking about the idea that connectivity has to be a cross-border affair. And one of many themes, spot on. We cannot restrict ourselves to those ideas of borders that kind of preceded us. So yeah, this is gonna be a whistle stop tour, like a little sort of taster tray, if you like, of lots of different themes and ideas, mostly to kind of get you all excited for the Q&A bit, because I think that's where we're gonna have the most fun. So I wanted to start by kind of talking about why, how the railways will fix the future and why change is the only path left. This is kind of a theme that I keep coming back to, and really, actually, the themes that I discuss are really all about storytelling. Like, it's all very well having the data, it's all very well having the maps, it's all very well having the policy kind of logic of how you're going to reach the point. But actually, if you cannot tell the story, then we'll never get any of it to happen. And I say that as an engineer, and engineers have somewhat forgotten that their role is first and foremost as storytellers, and secondarily as people who make physical stuff appear. So, you've had the intro. My background is in design engineering. I've been designing railways for over a decade now, but I do all sorts of stuff, media stuff and policy stuff as well. So that's kind of my background. My day job, though, is quite a lot of fun, actually. I'm currently leading on developing a strategy. Actually, I'm delivering the thing in a couple of weeks. I have developed a strategy, I should say, if my boss is listening, for the UK's, or for GB specifically's, railway test tracks, with a kind of a long legacy in pioneering our various excuses not to build high-speed rail, including a few of you might recognize the experimental version of the advanced passenger train there, but they're used for a much more diverse range of things here. We have two test tracks, and that's kind of a lot of fun. I'm enjoying that. And yes, I wrote the book, How the Rails Will Fix the Future. There are loads of railway books out there, dozens and dozens, hundreds, thousands, maybe. But I don't know of many that actually go and shout about what what a really positive future can look like with railways at their heart, and why that's such a good idea. And that's kind of why I thought, you know what, that's what I harp on about all the time. Perhaps I'll write a book about it. And it's been really well received. So for those of you who bought it, Bob, thank you, among others. A key point that I make in the book is that mobility must change. It has to change. Why, though? Well, we have a series of serious challenges planet-wide, frankly. We have a rapidly aging population, right? That's a truth across the world, a rapidly aging population. And associated with that are all the additional healthcare needs, the epidemic of loneliness that isn't just afflicting older people, but it's certainly a factor, and the need for public services to respond to that change in the way that we, the pattern of the number of people who work and the number of people who do not. We have a biodiversity crisis. We have a massive ecological crisis on our hands, and that's before we start talking about the big one, as I will in a moment. Huge ecological crisis across the planet again. And we have an enormous rise in populism, in the politics of hatred spreading across the world. These and more things are not separate issues. They are all interrelated. They are all connected. And the big one, of course, is climate change. This is the big one. I actually need to update this because there's a few more years of very dark red now appearing at one end of this. This is the global average temperature since 1850, represented in a rather nice, fetching-looking sort of scarf manufacturing pattern, if you're so interested. It's the big one, climate change. And climate change is something that we are having a massive impact on. Our impact on the climate is enormous, severe, and frightening. And the responses to that are kind of twofold from a whole society perspective. There is the reactive response of making things continue to work so that our society can continue to exist in a couple of centuries, our species, frankly. And for the railways, that's a pretty major one. Climate adaptation to a changing climate is a critical part of what I do day to day, as well as talking about. The other thing is being proactive. So that's reducing the amount of carbon that we kick into the atmosphere. And the quicker we do that, the better. Britain is a country renowned for doing the least it possibly can at the last possible minute. The trouble with that approach for climate change is that if any of you are familiar with the graph called the onion of doom, doing everything at the last possible minute, for us at least legally, we are aiming to reach net zero. If we do everything at the last minute, we'll have emitted 2 to 3 times more carbon than if we try to front load those carbon reductions. And of course, at the moment in the UK, we are cancelling railway projects left, right, and centre and going backwards and backwards on that. So it's bad news on that front. Now, here's a nice picture, or is it? A lot of the problems we can trace to modern urban development, well, they're not all of the US's fault, but a sizable quantity is from the growth of the suburbs. I live in the suburbs right now, slightly more compressed than these, thankfully. But the growth of the suburbs and the entrenchment of a car-dependent society and everything that tied into that, the idea of us being individualized, that might have made sense to the people selling, lawnmowers and picket fences and all these things back then, because every individual has to buy a lawnmower, then they don't have to share one, and then you can sell more lawnmowers. But the reality is that isolation, everyone in their own car, the urban fabric built to enable that, has isolated us for, on its way to 75 years, 3/4 of a century, we've been increasingly isolated. And we wonder why our political climate is where it is at now. And how do you unpick that? How do you unpick all the challenges I've talked about, whether it's climate change, whether it's car dependency, and all the associated populism, loneliness, ecological breakdown? Sometimes you need one big, powerful tool to break away from that. And that's where railways come in, and they are brilliant. Now, this is not going to be a podcast. It's not going to be a podcast at all. This is not going to be I've gone into podcast mode. This is not going to be a presentation where I bash the US. There's lots of me going, nope, Europe's not as good as you might think either. And this graphic is the first of those. This is how much on average people are traveling in Europe as individuals. And you can see that on average, the average person is traveling 8,530 kilometers, that's about 5,000 miles by road, and only just over 1,000 kilometers by rail. So, 500-600 miles by rail. That's in Europe. Admittedly, it's a lot worse in the US. But even in Europe, you can see that is an enormous volume of, if there are people and things moving, the chances are they're moving by road. And that is not ideal if you think about the impacts that roads have. And so at the moment, there's a huge policy drive, and this is certainly true in the US. It's absolutely true in Europe. It's very much true in the UK, that the solution to all of this is simply to electrify the road vehicles. It's to put batteries in everything. Now, this won't work. Battery cars, battery-powered cars are absolutely the future for cars, but battery-powered cars are not the future for transport. And there are 4 key factors, but there are 3 here that I want to really pull out as to, if someone asks you, well, why aren't EVs the future? And I'll just point out the fact that EVs, having electric cars makes no difference to the amount of harm that happens on the roads every year. The idea in Britain, 30,000 people are killed or seriously injured as a result of road accidents, road collisions. Every year. That's a tremendous number. If there's anything else, if the railways were doing that, good grief, they'd be shut down tomorrow. If anything else, any other disease was doing that, we would be taking drastic measures. Indeed, we did a few years back. We took drastic measures to respond to a disease with a similar level of fatality rate but roads, cars, nope, we're going to just let those people get killed. In the US, it's 30,000 people are killed a year. I believe that's pretty much the stat. 30,000 killed and seriously injured in the UK. 30,000 are just outright killed in the US as a result of road traffic collisions. That is an appalling epidemic. And the fact that and changing to electric vehicles will not help that. It will make things worse, because if we're saying, well, actually, we can forget railways and just use cars, that means more cars, means more injuries. Capacity is a key one. And I'm not just talking about congestion, because you can add infinite numbers of lanes to roads. Everyone here is familiar with the one more lane, bro type attitude, I'm sure, in all of your cities. But that it's not just that that's the problem. Roads are at their capacity in terms of how many nose-to-tail vehicles you can carry around, but also the physical limits of road infrastructure and in terms of the tonnages they can carry. As we haul more and more goods by road, our road surfaces, it's as a technology, cannot cope with that extra tonnage. They cannot cope. So in the UK, we have potholes, or somehow the hole in the road has become some sort of major political sort of thrust, which in a way it is, because it affects a lot of people's lives. But the solution to this is fill them in, rather than actually we have a major problem with too much traffic on the roads. And the third in this list I've got is exclusion. Electric vehicles are already more expensive than the average car. The average car is still too expensive for a sizable proportion of the population. So what we're doing is, that's not to mention charging infrastructure and so on and so on. What we're talking about is excluding more people from society by not just embedding car dependence, but making it even more acute by cars being less accessible to more people. So yeah, a real challenge. And of course, the other one is we don't have enough minerals on the planet to build that many electric vehicles. And even if we did, I would suggest it's probably not a good idea to dig that much lithium out the ground. There are better things we can do with it. Indeed, there are far better alternatives. That is, of course, 30th Street in Philly, a station that I have been to several times and absolutely adore. So there are two little themes I want to pick out. I told you this is going to be a whistle-stop tour all over the place, but I want to pick up a couple of themes in perhaps response to some of the policy stuff that will get thrown at you and that gets thrown at me. Two little things that I think are useful facts to have in your head. One is that the railways are humanity's default mass mover. That is a really key one. So this year is, in the UK, is some sort of festival called Railway 200. It's celebrating 200 years since the opening of the Stockton-Darlington Railway. The historic significance of that is frankly pretty dubious, but it's an important moment. The modern railways emerged in about 1830. They did emerge in the UK, but actually the railways are quite a lot older than that. We had steam locomotives in the UK in 1804, the first steam locomotive in the world, 1804. Trevithick's tramway train running on a tramway down in South Wales. But the railways have existed since at least 1400 in a form that we would recognize. 1495 is the earliest record of a railway that looks kind of like this. And the thing is, this technology doesn't appear out of thin air. So actually, you can trace back the first railway in history is Diolkos in Greece. It's the oldest record of a railway we have. A railway, by the way, being a system of a guided way with two rails or ruts or guidance systems set a certain distance apart, where that steers the vehicle rather than the person driving it. And it's designed for low friction. That's a railway. And Diolkos in ancient Greece, connecting the Ionian and Aegean seas, was the first railway. And it built up a reputation for being a speedy form of transport. And the Romans had these as well. The ruts that we see talked about from Roman chariots, which don't exist, by the way. Roman chariots existed in Ben-Hur and pretty much not anything else. Those rutways were not as a result of lots of wheels going over it. They were actively designed in there to guide things that we would perhaps recognize as trains around. You can see them in Pompeii, for example. So there is a long history of railways being the way that we move stuff around. And certainly, as the emerging industrialization of civilization focused on Central Europe, actually. So Switzerland, Austria, but particularly Austria and what is today modern Czechia, is where we saw the emergence of railway technology that we'd recognize. As long as humans have industrialized, we have had railways. So the idea that railways are only only a couple of hundred years old is not actually very useful from a policy perspective, because it allows politicians to say, well, they're transient. Maybe there's going to be something else next, which is not true. And kind of related to that, what's fantastic about railways, they are, let's put criticism of the modern tech industry to one side for a minute, the railways are humanity's greatest open source technology. What do I mean by that? There's this guy, George Stephenson. Now, what George Stephenson gave us is a thing that we call standard track gauge. He gave us a few other things, but standard track gauge is probably one of his greatest legacies, as well as much of the backbone of what is today's GB railway system. And he got that track gauge basically because by accident we had defined the track gauge as 4 foot 8 inches. He added the half a bit later. And 4 foot 8 inches only came from the fact that we had quite a number of tracks in the northeast of England that had been laid as plateways, not as edge rails, that had their center lines measured about 5 feet apart. So there's no science to the origin of track gauge. Don't believe the rubbish about horses' bottoms or about Roman chariots. That's a load of it's a myth. No, it just happened by accident because that's how science and history works. It's fun coincidences, and these things happen by accident. Now, the result of this is that anyone can go and build a railway so long as they put the track gauge in the right, the two rails the right distance apart. Like that's the joy of it, So from 1820 when Hetton Colliery appeared. And yet we seem to have forgotten this because you go to Padova, which is a beautiful city. Most people just go there to travel to Venice, but actually Padova in and of itself is very beautiful. It's got this weird thing that goes around there, and it's got one rail in the middle. It doesn't have two rails next to each other. It's got one rail in the middle. So these are buses guided by one rail, which then begs the question, well, why not just put two rails in? Why put this bespoke guideway in? Well, there's a whole chapter in the book worth looking at that. But the point is that this is a bus, firstly. And secondly, having this proprietary system has locked Padova into the situation where it cannot expand this system because the provider has mostly gone bust, isn't interested in actually developing this technology any further. So they're stuck with a system they can't upgrade, they can't expand, when they should have just gone for regular old trams, marvelous trams. And this is true for some of this optical tramway stuff that China tried to get working. They exported to Indonesia, and Indonesia said, "This is junk. We'll just build a normal tram, thanks." Trams exist and they're brilliant. We don't need to reinvent this technology, and that's kind of a key thing that I want to point out here. By both these two things, we don't need to reinvent transport because railways are our default mass mover, and we don't need to reinvent the technologies either because we've solved the technological challenges with railways. That's really key. And yet you still see people trying to push these sort of, whether it's rendered in the 50s or whether it's kind of CGI today, you've got autonomous vehicles, driverless cars, which are a thing which they might be running around. They might be convincing you that they're running around currently in San Francisco, but they aren't. They're on a grid pattern. They can't go on the highway and they get scared when it's cloudy. There will never be driverless cars. There will never be driverless cars. Likewise, Hyperloop is rubbish. It's a load of nonsense. It's been recommended. The context is important. It was recommended specifically to kill off California High-Speed Rail, which in an unpleasant roundabout kind of way it has. But this is, again, it's stuff made up by people who are trying to sell us something when we don't need to reinvent the technologies. We have this stuff down. We've done it. And this goes into the rail industry itself. This is true for some of these alternatives to just sticking wires above the railway. Batteries have a place on the railway. Less of a place than might be being pitched at the moment. Hydrogen does not have a place powering freight or passenger trains. It might have a place for machines, plant inspection trains, but not frontline passenger and freight services. And yet hydrogen is a similar sort of gadget band kind of FM solution being proposed that doesn't really solve us any problem. So rail is messy. That's the problem. We have railways. They are messy. And that's why politically they're occasionally something that causes people upset because they exist in a real messy world where they get battered by climate change and are hard to put together. Now, we're already 20 minutes in. I'm going to hammer through this next bit. The railway top 20, let's talk about the US railway system, because in the book there is a railway top 20. The US railroads come in at number 17, I'm afraid to say. They're above Britain, so good work on that front, but they are below pretty much every other major railway system in the world. And you might say, but we have the world's best freight railroad system. That's not actually true. The freight railroads move, in absolute terms, quite a lot of freight, although not as much as a couple of other countries. But in relative terms to the population, if you normalize per capita, you're not moving that much freight. It's still a large amount of freight compared to the rest of the world, but you're kind of rolling down to fifth, sixth, seventh in terms of freight moved per capita. And unfortunately, when you look at a whole railway system, because a railway system has to be thought of as a whole, as you all know on this call, the amount of passenger rail travel in the US is, as a whole, extremely diminutive compared to the percentage of road miles. So in terms of modal share, rail barely factors. So that's why the US is down at number 17. There are things that could be done to fix that, and there are opportunities to resolve that. But so there we go. So there are some lessons to learn from that top 20 though. And again, I'm going to hammer through these at high speed. Fourfold. First one, liberalization has chased, not created demand. This is a very European oriented one, admittedly, because the US railroads have been kind of a different shape for a very long time. But really what this is saying, in Europe, we've had a big push to liberalize, to kind of undo nationalization, to liberalize rail markets. And the key thing in that story is that this has chased, it's come after often it's said, well, privatization in the UK was a great success because ridership jumped up a huge amount. But I always have to point to this graph and remind people that no, as you can see here, the upwards line started before privatization happened. So privatization had nothing to do with it. There is a bigger world out there. Macro effects and urbanization had a much bigger part to play. So that's a key factor in that. And in the US, well, people, you get people saying that the class one railroads are why the US railroads are so good. It isn't so good. So that calls into question how useful the class one railroad model is for having a successful railway in the US and indeed across North America. I would postulate, based on the data, not very. So liberalization, avoiding investment is expensive. Again, I'm going to point my finger at Europe this time, so you can laugh, but also be aware that the same story very much in the US, lack of investment. And across Europe, we're seeing a substantial malaise, let's put it that way, in investment in railways in Europe right now. Not a huge amount of inland transport investment. It's not increased dramatically when it should be. And the result is, here's Germany, and here's one of their railway bridges falling into a river. Not ideal. And meanwhile, Germany, of course, is magically spending a lot of extra money, changing its fiscal rules, but just for defense. Not for anything useful like, I don't know, climate change resolution and building more railways, but for defense. Us getting busy pretending that we need to fight each other rather than the existential crisis that is going to affect our entire species, no matter what country we live in. The next one, accountability must shape structure. So the UK, or rather GB specifically, Northern Ireland has its own system that's fully nationalised and much more integrated. GB, England, Wales, Scotland, has a horribly atomised railway industry. And we're in the process of trying to stitch some of it back together. We're not going far enough. The result of that is a lot of the mess that we have in terms of the costs of delivering better services, better infrastructure, among other things. But the other key thing is not just the industry structure, it's the centralisation into Westminster that's a problem in the UK. Every country has its own challenges with the structures being a problem. The countries that perform best on our list, on the top 20 list, have got the balance between regionalisation, city empowerment, and centralisation far better. So Switzerland probably is a perfect example of getting the right balance of power between a central controlled system, the power of the regions, so the context, the parallel being the states for yourselves. So that exists. And in a way, the US has the chance to get ahead on this because, federal government, as you all know right now, is let's put this politely, in a bit of a mess. The fact that you have fairly strong state government allows you to do much more devolved power, but the states don't levy enough of that towards railways. So, right, and this is my four-option pathway to improving the US railroads. This is a section in the book that got cut, actually, that I need to write an article out of. But to cut it short, the dominance of the Class 1 railroads means that regional and intercity passenger service frequencies away from the Northeast Corridor are, I would politely describe them as pathetic and essentially non-existent. And I would imagine that most of you on this call probably agree with that, right? You've got daily, I'm not even going to talk about Cincinnati, but, if a service is less than once a day, doesn't even exist as a service. I would say that an intercity service that runs at less than every 2 hours isn't a service. But so the first thing you need to do is either nationalize and combine all the Class 1 railroads and then proceed to then split that out to state level probably, but get the structure right, but nationalize all the Class 1s. So that's means that you can then take a state and federal level view of where prioritization needs to happen between freight and between passenger, and take a much more strategic view of what the balance is there, rather than, no, we shall only carry lignite and intermodal and nothing else. The second option is for state and federal authorities to overlay a completely new passenger rail system over the top of the existing network, leaving the Class 1s to their own devices. This is an option. I would suggest it's Probably not the most time efficient option or the most cost efficient option, but it is an option. The third option is some combination of the two of those, um, where you nationalize bits that you need to, or perhaps you take the infrastructure entirely state owned and you let the class ones sort of run as open access freight operators closer to the European model. And again, then take that much more measured approach, that more broad understanding of how to prioritize services and make the infrastructure work. At this point, for the US, your class one railroads will all have gone bust in 15 to 20 years, if not less than that. That's just a statement of fact. The model that they have is asset strip and basically turn what we have into something that will not function. And specifically in terms of workers, the staff, the staff running the class one railroads, at some point they will go, you know what? No, I'm out. I'm off. And a presidential decree to stop a national strike happening won't work another time. There is a fourth option then, which is that you do nothing, as in not you lot, you aren't to blame, as in the authorities, both at federal and state level, do nothing, and the consequence is that the railroad system will collapse in onto itself. So I don't see that as bleak. I see that as exciting because there are options to fix this. It can be fixed. There are pathways. Probably the hybrid model is the right path to take, but status quo is not good enough. It's not going to work. And the big picture stuff here is about thinking long-term, thinking holistically. I'm going to not say much about this because I'll open it up to questions. But HS2 is a perfect project to show engineer-wise, fine, whatever. Politically is exactly how not to deliver a high-speed rail project. And California High-Speed Rail, exactly the same story. And a lot of that is from the lack of storytelling about what its purpose is. Here's the guy who cancelled it, but actually it's less his responsibility now because we have a new government and they've also kept it cancelled, so it's their fault too. The key thing is that we absolutely must think. We must think bigger. There is the potential, absolutely the potential, to have a full high-speed rail network. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The US is the perfect shape for a high-speed rail network. It's the perfect size for a high-speed rail network. It's enormous. There is plenty of land to put these railways. You've got huge interstates that you can just put the railway next to for the most part. Perfect for high-speed rail. Bring those journeys down and obliterate the aviation sector as much as you can. There are big opportunities here. That's exciting. But you have to think bold. The opportunities are endless. There are many things at play here. It's not just about the benefits the railways bring, but also you're talking about a world where good, high-quality jobs, both working on the railroad, whether it's traditional blue-collar or traditional white-collar, there are huge amounts of jobs, good quality jobs out there, real jobs that have a meaningful impact on people's lives. And the opportunity is exciting. Rail cannot be seen in isolation. You have to think about mobility in totality. You have to think about the whole picture. That's a really key part of this story. If you're telling the story, don't just tell the story of trains. Tell the story of how mobility gets better. Oh, and you can find me on social media. No, let's do some questions. That was a bit. Sorry that overran a bit, Rick and Chris and everyone. But yeah, hopefully a bit of a whistle stop tour there. I shall abandon my screen for you all.
Well, being a regular listener of your podcast, I'm impressed.
You're used to this
Yeah.
chaos. Yes.
So, well, first, there's some things I want to emphasize, right? The first is, this is not an emphasize, just a point. For those who don't know, in the options, that last locomotive was the Penn Central Railroad, where in part of the asset stripping strategy that railroads have had since 1917.
Yes. Yeah.
They merged two competing railroads and it was a disaster. And in the run up to that, we lost both Penn Station and Chicago Union Station. So for those who don't know that picture, that's a key thing.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of things you said that I just want to make sure people heard. The first is, if it's not at least every 2 hours, it's not a true service. I think that's what you said.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, this business of 2 or 3 trains a day, and we're going to spend 10 years to try to get 2 or 3 trains a day running, has proven to be a failure. We need to get out of that. The other thing that was really important, I want to emphasize, is our railroads are not carrying the freight they should be carrying, let alone the people. And the reason for that is, right around World War I, New York, being money people, figured out there was a way to make money in railroads by stripping the assets and declining over time. And there are people like you who say that might last for another 10 or 15 years. I can see the
It,
case. I don't know
two,
how
it
they.
might last two. If I was conscious of my audience. I don't think it'll last. I think 5 years would be lucky for the class ones to continue in the way they do things, right? Like, yeah.
I, I can see that argument. Um, then if you could bring up the other thing I want to actually absolutely emphasize is we must think bigger. Thinking about getting one train a day started is a step in the right direction. We've got to be bold. This is too urgent to allow it to go on for decades and decades because we are just running out of time. So in that theme there, can you bring up that map, the national map?
Ooh, I can. This is one that I sketched in. Let me share screen again. Let me just was back to that wee national map. Let me just. This is one I sketched in as a what might it look like. It's a little bit of Alan Levy's map in there, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. There's a little bit of all sorts in there, but it's not. Don't look too. There's not too much science in here. It's an idea of what you could have. Multiple transcontinental high speed lines would make sense. Multiple north south, the model, the shape of the US is pretty favorable to a high speed connectivity. There is some geography in a few of the places. Getting to Atlanta from the north, for example, is will involve some tunnels. Yeah, don't dwell too much on the map stuff, everyone. There's some good chat I can see in the discussion. But yeah,
Okay.
sorry, Rick.
So that was the
The
question
map.
I
Yeah, don't
wanted
get too
answered.
excited about the map. Yeah.
So it's another crayon map,
Yeah,
but
no.
we
This
could,
was me just saying that you can that people can and should be bold, but it was illustrative rather than
but
any
here's
deep
the important
science.
thing about these crayon maps. They almost always look the same.
Oh yeah. It's
It-
because you join it's a join the dots exercise. You pick your big cities, you draw a line between them. It's not rocket science, it is that simple. I know that some people have very disjointed. They go for, well, just focus on one side, focus on the other side. You'll never have a high speed rail system that joins one side of the country to the other. China, that connects from one side of the country to the other with a high-speed rail with a service that runs every 2 hours, would beg to disagree. What China has done is driven up its modal share dramatically by doing that. The point, Rick, that you're talking about, the reason I talk about frequency being important, if you're talking about a service every 2 or 3 times a day, who's using that? How does that fit into anyone's life usefully? Like, the point is that if you have a service that's even every 2 hours is a bit sparse for the way that people live their lives. As a transport system, if you want to drive mode shift, that's moving people away from air and away from road, it needs to be an option. And if you've got a train if your choice is, oh, do I go in the morning on the one train, or do I come back tomorrow? Like, that's not a choice. That's not a choice. And so, yeah, service frequency is really important. And yes, the longer distances in the US means that you need more trains, literally more trains to facilitate that. But yes, that's how a train system works. Yes, exactly. Do that. Buy more trains. Manufacture them in the US and don't build a new factory for every 5 new trains you build. There are ways that you can be more efficient to deliver this stuff. Um, you know,
Uh, and again, we want to take that back down since you had said let's not emphasize this.
yeah, hide it, hide it, hide it.
I've long believed that the core foundational problem is that the infrastructure is privately owned,
Yeah.
and you're not going to get a lot of people who are interested in a 50-year investment with a lot of risk at the upfront. And so from that perspective, it makes the most sense for the class ones to continually reduce the size of their physical plant, which is what's been happening for 100 years. So Thatcher tried turning the infrastructure over to private industry, and that failed miserably. And I have an opinion about why.
It wasn't even Thatcher. It was after Thatcher. She thought the railways were one step too far. Even Thatcher thought that. So it
Oh,
was
I'm
actually
sorry.
post Thatcher. It was John Major who decided in a panic to off the back of it was a bit like COVID actually. COVID flipped the political cross party agreement the railways were a good idea. COVID kicked that into touch, and it was the same in the 90s. The early 90s recession resulted in ridership. British Rail was running the most efficient railway system in Europe. The early 90s recession happened, and because of we'd had 10 years of Thatcher, no one had any money, so we stopped traveling by train, particularly in London, where the big changes to who was being employed at that point. That very temporarily hit ridership, panicked government, and they said, oh, maybe we better just privatize it, and then we'll just let it die. And obviously, it then didn't do that. It did the opposite of that. And the system that had been built up was designed for a railway to be asset stripped and decayed. And it turned out that the railways actually went from strength to strength. and the system was completely not set up to facilitate growth. It was set up to do the opposite, which is to do manage decline. So yeah, sorry, Rick, you're right,
But
absolutely. But even I suppose it even really emphasizes your point. Even Thatcher didn't think that the railways were a good idea for privatization, and she obviously made some bad calls on a number of other fronts that I won't need to go through here.
so I apologize for making that mistake. But my view uh, is that a key part of the problem was the private owners of the infrastructure needed to get their dividends and their return on capital. And so money that should have been going into track wasn't going into track. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
essentially, there's no better way to understand the failures of particularly the infrastructure being privatized than the succession of rail crashes that happened in the kind of the mid to late 90s and the early 2000s, specifically as a result of the privatized rail structure in the UK. And a key one, which was from my track engineer, you can't see above me because Zoom's cropped it, but I've got some Pandrel clips behind me behind my head. I'm a track guy. And our track crash was Hatfield, where a rail literally shattered like glass under a train going through because Railtrack, the private rail organization, didn't. They were like, no, we can't stop running trains to maintain this railway because then we'll make less money. And so they didn't let the maintainer get in and actually fix the problem. Actually, the book goes into detail on this because it really typifies exactly the problems with letting private capital be in charge of safety critical infrastructure. But it was really bad. And this is why it's a very, very good thing that the Northeast Corridor, I mean, don't get me wrong, Norfolk Southern love dropping a coal train on the Northeast Corridor. They just can't help themselves. But it's a good thing that the one piece of decent high density long distance infrastructure you have is owned by you all and not owned by the class ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we should Rick, you and I could talk for hours and hours. I'm conscious we should throw to the floor, right?
I agree with you. I want one more question though. It may be, this is not something I've ever heard you talk about, but
Ooh, okay.
it just occurred to me. So, and somebody did ask a question about in the US, should we have a national structure or a fractured structure? And China, when I first started riding Chinese high-speed trains, there was a thing called the Minister of Railroads.
Mm.
They decided that politically something was wrong with that structure, so they created a new one. But there were also individual railroads that reported to the minister, so it was kind of a mix. Do you understand in brief how
Yeah,
that's
so I
structured?
have the way I said it's a very good question. It's really important. It gets to the heart of everything. And I touched on it here is getting the structure right. What you want to do is get the structure right so that the decisions that impact on the people, so that the decisions are being made closest to the people that use the system. So if you have big long distance infrastructure, big long distance services, then a pan state organization needs to oversee those. But a lot of a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the services actually need to be state at a state level. Of course, a lot of people's movements aren't necessarily, they're often across state boundaries and left, right, and center. But if you strip too much up to federal level, you you will basically have too much. It would be too slow, too sluggish to resolve the challenges. It's too much decision, too much in the kind of making those decisions about how it all fits together. What you should have is more funding going to states or states where the federal role is standards, skills, so things that can be done better at a national level. So standards, skills, and also uh, legislation that forces the states to spend the right money on the right thing. So making sure that they are spending money less on highways, more on railways, on railroads. That is what the federal level can do. But in terms of actually plotting what the network should look like, that should go to state level. And indeed, below that should be at city level. So I would say that it's getting there are different things that need to be in different places. And the responsiveness is really important. So a city, bearing in mind most people live in cities, and that's certainly true in the US, cities need to have a decent amount of funding and autonomy to deliver city infrastructure. Then when you overlay regional rail, then that's probably going to be at state level. And then when it comes to big strategic thinking, it might not be that the federal level would fund, and frankly, with the state we've seen of California high-speed rail, actually federal funding being able to be pulled is obviously staggering and frustrating. Funding and the project lead might be at state level, but showing what the map should look like. So saying it will join into this overall strategic picture would perhaps be at the federal level. So I think there's a way to structure it based on what the output is. Like things like skills, standards. It doesn't make sense for every state to have its own standards. certainly not for regional railway stuff. Like that stuff can be consolidated. On the flip side of that, you don't. It's not right for federal government to be thinking about what regional rail is running within a state. That doesn't make any sense at all. So yeah, you can map it based on what the right split is, and based on getting those decisions as close to the. A word I use a lot is democratization. Railways work best. Railroads work best when they're democratized. People need to feel like they have ownership of the system that's running alongside them. So, arguably, the way I see it is that Amtrak would actually only be running long distance services that go across states, and actually that you would prioritize getting those intercity, you would have intercity links, bearing in mind that your states are like the size of a country anyway. Like those intercity links would be run at a state level. Potentially, it might be that some states go, we don't want to do that. Can it be Amtrak? Fine. One size doesn't fit all. But in terms of seeing the most rapid delivery of infrastructure, what you want to do is empower the states to deliver the right thing. And then those states that have no interest in railroads, then maybe at federal level would step in, or we can riot from the ground up, one or the
other. Excellent. Chris, are there any questions?
There are. It's a riot from the ground up. I'll try to. We've got a lot of questions, and I will try to batch them, by topic. But here's a basic one right off the bat from Stephen, and I know that a few other people have joined midway. If you missed the beginning or would like to see a recording, yes, we do have recordings of this talk, or we will have a recording of this talk along with all our other talks. If you go to hsrail.org/events. We have an archive there of the talks. It takes us a few days to, sort of lightly edit these and post them, but this talk will be there sometime next week, most likely. So we have more substantively, we have a few questions about the highway lobby. Jay says and asks, many of our rail projects in the US depend on federal and state support. How do you recommend continuing to advocate and push for rail projects when there is so much oil, car, and plane lobbying in our government that is hostile to expanding rail? And then a related question from Tom, how do we overcome the political clout of the highway lobby? And is there a precedent from Europe?
The precedent, the trouble is the precedent from Europe, in some bits of it work for the US, some bits of it don't. The US is its own very unique thing, right? The structure of the structure of the country, the structure of its government, and also the nature of the car fundamentally, and the oil are kind of deep rooted into US culture, and that isn't necessarily, that sometimes the good thing about that is that if you tackle that, you can upend it. So there are lessons from Europe. There are also not lessons. The thing I would say, the most critical thing to give an answer to that, what I would focus on doing is grassroots, ground up organizing. So it's actually building that support so that the people who start getting elected are the people who agree with what we're saying. And if you start getting local representatives elected that way and then working your way up, you build a political movement that solves that problem. That is on its own not enough. You need people, shakers and movers, going up to the top of government and jabbing people in the ribs, kind of like what I do in the UK, where I go into Parliament and I just jab people in the ribs and tell them what they're doing is rubbish. So you have to do all of it, but do not underestimate the extent. Hiding it, like we have to get out there and go on the street and speak to people and explain to them why their lives will be better. This is the storytelling piece. It's so important. You have to go out there, work with local politicians. You can sit. This is not something that doesn't work. Look what's just happened in NYC with Mum Danny, right? You have an option, someone who is building a story that is going to individuals saying your life is bad, and here are the genuine reasons why your life is why you're struggling, and here are some of the things that I can do to solve that problem. That's where, from a transport perspective, that's what I've been trying to do as much as I can in the UK. I'm going to do more of as I get older and grayer, no doubt, is building that organizing from the bottom up and getting people on board, getting the unions involved, kind of get those local political organizing that are not Democrat, not Republican, they're independent of that, actually going out walking on streets, speaking to people who maybe don't agree, and telling them, like, the reason you find life difficult is because you have to sit in your car the whole time. Like, that's horrible. You've all wasted your time on unpleasant experience. You sat in traffic. Go and speak to those people. That is the way that's one of the key things to do. We can't just sit on Twitter or Blue Sky and moan about the fact that, evidence. Look, there's a thing called the evidence-based paradox, right? It's a really interesting paradox. I'm a proponent of evidence-based policy, but if I'm a proponent of evidence-based policy, the evidence shows that evidence-based policy doesn't work to make good policy happen, because it hasn't, has it, so far? So clearly the evidence shows that evidence-based policy doesn't work. So what we need is something more than that. that's the paradox bit, right? Evidence-based policy. What we need is the passion, the storytelling. We need to get people really excited about what that future looks like. It can't just be, oh, boohoo, cars are bad. It has to be, you will have things will be brilliant if we get this right. That you've got to just really paint that picture and do so right from the ground up.
All right, well, let's continue with this theme of organizing and advocacy. Robert says, I'm looking to bring commuter rail to my region. I've joined local nonprofits that are pro building rail already, and I'm wondering if there are any good examples or success stories of countries, states, or regions that have built a regional commuter rail from scratch that I could follow as an example.
The trouble with being in Europe is that we don't generally we don't do much of that. In terms of, we are lucky that mostly we have a essentially functioning transport system. So look, Brightline, I wouldn't describe Brightline as the model of perfect success, but they have managed to get a railway system running more than was otherwise. And also it's something that we can then, when Brightline makes the wrong financial decision and goes down the toilet, or they plow into one car too many on their various level crossings, and there's an opportunity to perhaps turn that into a state entity, whatever. But in terms of good examples of getting commuter rail, you want to look to somewhere like Australia, because passenger rail in Australia currently is going through a bit of a renaissance, certainly at city region level. So commuter rail in a very American sense, as in like, the kind of the commuter rail in the UK is an electric train that runs very high frequencies and looks like a metro. In the US and Australia, commuter rail is much more tidal flows of a big loco with a bunch of coaches that runs, a few trains in the morning, a few trains in the evening. Turning that into regional services in Australia is probably where is some good examples of good practice. I have an episode of the podcast coming out showing some of those examples of success. And I'll recommend that because it goes into detail for them. But actually look to Australia for some of those examples of good practice.
Okay, thanks. Gabe says from Arizona, the Arizona DOT is in the process of beginning to study a regional rail system connecting Phoenix, some of its suburbs, and Tucson by rail. How much is it worth locals pushing to ensure that this is built to be future-proofed for including future high-speed rail connections, somewhere down the line, or even building the line itself as high speed, or would it be better to first just make sure that it gets built anyway?
So yeah, really, these are all really good questions, by the way. If you have to send me the ones that don't get answered, because this is great. We'll just do another Q&A session only, right? So the good thing about railways is that mostly they're straight anyway, right? So for the most part, when you build a railroad, you build it straight. So actually, to build a new railroad, particularly if it's in green or brownfield, it's mostly going to be ready to run up to 150, 160 plus miles an hour anyway. What I would say is get the route, get the right of way and the line of route protected, but build that thing as build it as quickly as you can. So like engineers can bodge a thing to do the job it needs to do after the fact, but get the thing running so that you get you start getting people interested in and seeing how good the railway can be, and then go. That's maybe counter to some of the things I say elsewhere, where I say no, build it right first time. But actually in the US, I'd say actually given that the baseline is 0 in a lot of cases, get the thing built and then people can see what the value can be. Yes, I'd say get it built, but make sure that there is a view of what the longer term can look like, so that nothing gets built. Stations, for example, don't get built in obviously stupid places. So build the thing for what it needs to do now, but make sure that there are dotted lines of it might do this in the future, so let's not compromise that. So you don't need to, passive provision is the phrase that you might be looking for. You don't even need to build the alignment to be good for 160 or plus. But to be honest, with an in-city railway, you should be looking at a 200-kilometer-an-hour railway minimum anyway, particularly in the US where distances are long.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, Gary Sprung has just said it perfectly, actually. Get it built so people can see the value. So many Americans have never ridden a train. This is why the US question is so uniquely, like, it's a little bit different. It is get the thing built so people can see how good a train can be. 100%. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Let's turn to a couple questions about infrastructure. And this one from Bob kind of gets at sort of like, starting from where we are, sort of the reality on the ground today. So he says, North America has thousands of timber rail bridges, many with no masonry or concrete abutments. Given the wildfires and flash flooding, is the era of timber rail bridges past?
I love that you still have timber rail bridges, and it's an example of where like timber works. It's a good building material, but in a this is where I talked earlier about reactive, the climate resilience point. climate resilience in the UK is we're already a damp sponge of a country. That's why it smells so bad in the UK. But like, if you like the US, in a lot of parts of the US, particularly California, in fact, huge parts of the US, flooding for sure a major issue, but also things just spontaneously bursting into flames is also a climate issue, right? So building climate resilient infrastructure, yeah, I dare say you can build fire resistant timber structures, but if you're doing that, the cost of building a new structure for just making it a concrete structure that has resilience to that sort of thing, I would say, yeah, probably the time for a rolling program of one by one replacing those structures, those wonderful timber trestle structures with concrete or steel structures is the time for that is now for sure.
Okay.
I'm trying
And
to answer quickly. I need to be quicker. Sorry.
no, this is great. Thank you.
They're such good questions.
Also, in your view, should all high-speed rail eventually be electrified, or will we, will we keep some trains
Right.
running on diesel?
If a railway is not electrified, it's not high speed. Like, I don't care if you're running a train that's. I say this is something in the UK. We have 200-kilometer-an-hour diesel trains running around. They cannot be called high-speed rail. A railway is incomplete if it doesn't have electrification. It's not a nice to have. It's not like a thing you sell. It's no, a railway, a modern railway includes the electrification. That's just part of a railway. It is a fundamental part of a railway as much as the rails are. If a railway is not electrified, it's not finished. And for nothing is high-speed rail until it has wires over it. Like, I could get that's a whole episode on that, sure. Episode talk on that. But like, it's just, and I'm saying this as a country that's just cancelled more electrification projects. Like, this, not just the US who's daft on this. The Anglosphere is just bonkers on this stuff. Like, rightly, we're being laughed at. A railway, the whole point of electrification is you take the literal power station, the multi-megawatt power station that is the generator for a train, the locomotive or multiple locomotives, and you put it on the ground and turn it into just a regular power station, and then you, through the grid, put the electricity into the train. A train carrying around its own power station is obviously daft. Don't do that. We've solved the technology to not do that. Don't do that. It's just a huge waste of moving energy around. Lighten up your trains. You don't have to build your infrastructure as substantially. No, don't do that. Yeah, no. I don't know if that was a coherent answer, but possibly an entertaining one.
But
What?
batteries are going to solve the whole problem, Gareth.
Yeah, yeah.
There was a question about batteries, but let's keep moving. Let's move to some questions.
That was my answer for the batteries question. The noise I just made. Yeah.
Okay. We have a few questions about sort of the broader network, which we've touched on, of course, along the way here. Hannah asks, how do you balance the need for the timing and delivering high-speed rail versus quote unquote regular speed rail, particularly for passenger service? As much as she says, as much as I would love a big high-speed rail system in the US, I worry that it won't be effective without building out a network of intercity and interstate rail first and people getting used to that idea.
It's an extremely, extremely good point to raise. The challenge is, for me, is you need to do both. You can't wait for one. Then, if you've got the Gantt chart, if you like, going into my engineering project manager thing, you can't wait for one to be finished and then do the other. You kind of need to race both along at the same time, and in a way, they'll feed into each other a bit. So the impetus behind high-speed rail coming will kind of push state authorities it'll embarrass state and federal authorities into having to get the other stuff to work. So in a way, you kind of need both to happen at the same time. It's a very good point that obviously just building if I snap my fingers and create a full high-speed rail network in the US, half the people wouldn't be able to use it because, as you say, a massively suburbanized population, very disparately spread population, and lots of cities that are huge cities that wouldn't be on that map that would still need to be connected into the whole that have no rail connection whatsoever. Yeah, but both need to happen at the same time. They need to run in parallel. You can't wait for one before starting the other. Very, very good question.
Great, thank you. Two similar questions. Johan asked, is it better to have a national network like Amtrak or to divide it up somehow? And then Timothy asks, can you talk a bit about open access operator systems and the broad pros and cons as an approach for getting more of the existing US rail network into use for passenger services?
Yeah, two things on that front. Well, that would make sense because it's a two-part question. So I'll do open access first. No, I won't do open access first. I'll answer the first one first. In fact, I'll do the open access first. So open access operators, yes, open access when you have capacity. Open access is a reasonably good model for making use of that free capacity. In the UK, basically doesn't work for domestic services because all of our railways are basically like you have a green aspect for a few seconds and then it's back to amber and red again. Like our railway is that congested. It's very, very busy, very highly optimized timetables. Um, but open access in the US could work if you force the class ones to maintain their infrastructure for starters, and you basically force them through regulation to not just say no to everything. Then actually open access is certainly an opportunity. When kind of related then to that, the Amtrak versus more of a state split devolved system, I'd say it's not one size fits all. This is kind of a similar discussion that's happening in the UK right now with our new Great British Railways that's being set up. It's BR but with a more naff name. Except that it isn't, annoyingly. It very specifically isn't in a few ways. But anyway, the point of that is there's currently discussions ongoing about what should be devolved still and what should then be done nationally. And I think it can't be one size fits all. You'll have some states that absolutely have the administrative infrastructure and the funding appetite to run with it and create their own pretty good integrated system. Again, it should be tied into buses. It should be tied into other forms of transit. Railways on their own. Ideally, you'd have like a state transit authority that is branded as such and then integrates intercity buses, intercity rail, regional bus, regional rail. Other states won't have the appetite, the administrative capacity, or perhaps even the infrastructure to do that. And they might say, actually, Amtrak, can you run those for us? What I would then say is, at least then brand those as state. Amtrak might have an Amtrak logo saying this is Amtrak, by the way, but brand them as state infrastructure, as state kind of trains. Come up with a nice livery that is the state's trains. Because I think that ownership, that feeling of ownership, is really important for mode shift. It's really important for people feeling like the system is theirs. I love Amtrak. I love Amtrak's branding from a little while back before it all got a little bit clip art. Amtrak's a wonderful thing, right? But I think there is value to having a state-led. One of the great things about the US is the empowerment of the states. Having a state-led passenger infrastructure maps better onto people actually being able to use the system and input into it, and changes being made more quickly than them having to trundle through the federal kind of the slow morass of federal decision making. Yeah, branding's really important, by the way. Branding is so important, and just like cities should have integrated branding across all the transport modes, whether it's bicycle hire, whether it's buses, whether it's tram, train, what have you. The same is kind of true at a state level as well. Like you kind of want to have the kind of some of that regional identity to kind of be rightly US people. You're all proud of the states that you come from, other than if you're from the Midwest, in which case you enjoy making fun of the states that you're in. But no, like you have pride over your states, and in a way that's good. Well, not in a way. That's cool. That's great. And there's all those wonderful stories that can get put into the story of that state's railroad as well, and that can move away from trying to hark back to the days of the horrible big railroad conglomerates and let the states take ownership of their own. Kind of undo some of the ill of the railroads caused in the creation of the modern US by letting the states kind of take ownership of that. Sorry, I've talked a lot there, but it's kind of it gets fun into the fun of the story of the US, right? And actually telling that storytelling again, telling that story and getting people passionate about their railroads is really important, particularly in the kind of political climate we're in at the moment.
So we're at the hour. Are you willing? Can you stay a little longer?
I can. I need. Yeah, I can do another 5 minutes. What we should do is do another one of these as a Q&A one. It's probably what we should do, actually.
I would love to do that.
Because it would be great to do a follow-up, because all these questions have been so good and I'm absolutely chomping at it, but I'm conscious of a 2-year-old and that I need to get down and support with dinner. So I can't stay for much longer, but I would love to keep up. These are such good questions. There's so much more to be discussed.
Well, but let me just say again, if you loved this program, highspeedrail.us, click that become a member. If you're already a member, click it anyway. Yes. And buy the book. Absolutely. Absolutely. And Rail Natter is your podcast, Rail Natter.
Yeah. Rail Natter, yeah.
So let's, I guess, do one more question and then...
Yeah, let's do one more question,
Yeah.
and then I'll
Okay.
give it to you.
Just very quickly, there was a question about through-running trains at Penn Station. 2 weeks from today, we have another webinar on exactly that topic. So please, everyone, Brian who asked that question, and anyone else is welcome to join us then. But let's end with one more question, sort of a big picture question from one of our close collaborators, Dan Bilka, who asks, can a large-scale visionary national project actually bring down the costs of doing the individual routes and components by having a rolling program?
100%. extremely, I mean, rolling programs are very important. This is a really good point of raising that balance between federal, state, and that relationship is something like a rolling national program of a US wide program of intercity and high speed railway construction. Building a high-speed railway is the same as building any other railway. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Like, you're just building a railway. It's all the same skills and knowledge with maybe some slight differences to the standards. So those skills absolutely cascade down. And so yes, absolutely. And that's true not just for building the whole railway, which is a thing that you still have to do in lots of bits of the US, but also for things like accessibility improvements, electrification, signaling, some of the key things that that need to be upgraded on a lot of the railroad network. Having a rolling program of those that probably is pan state, so you spread some of those skills. But equally, at that point, yeah, then you kickstart getting some of those state-led skills as well, so that the states do have their own incumbent skill sets. And in a way, some of the states might get out ahead of the game and grow their own skill sets that they can then export, and that can be great for their service economy and things of this nature. The railways, even by like neoliberal measurements of what is good, railroads give us all those good things because you grow skills. They're good jobs. Those jobs can be both location based and home based, mobile, all these things. You name it, the railroads can deliver it. They've just got to be given a chance, and we get that chance by, I think, mostly telling that damn story.
All
Feels
right.
like a good point to end, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Again, thank you so much for coming. Have you committed to a follow-up webinar? We will, if you have,
if you'll have me, I would absolutely love to do it. It won't take us as long to organize the next one because I know what the deal is, and we'll just get it done, Chris. But if that's something that you'd be interested in, I would love to have a follow-up. It's just there are so many good questions there and lots of really interesting discussion points. Yeah,
we are going to do that. Thank you all to our members. So again, highspeedrail.us. How Railways Will Fix the Future is a great book. I listened to it. So it is available on Audible. And thank you all for coming today, and we will ride again. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
cheerio.